Chapter 2. The Building of a Planetary Girdle of Light, 1968 through 70. The ongoing growth of Blyton's community led him to initiate a series of board meetings in the early summer of 1968 to formulate bylaws for what he was now calling the Holy Order of Mans. After careful deliberation, a final draft was typed and approved. Blyton and his wife then drove to Sacramento and filed the bylaws on July 24, 1968. This brief document, which would be continually amended by Blyton over the next 6 years, delineated the order's purpose, governing structure, sacramental forms, and membership regulations. It provides an invaluable snapshot of the group's self-understanding and internal organization at the time of its official birth as a religious order. The bylaws stated that the primary purposes of the order were to preserve the ancient Christian wisdom teachings for the coming generation, and to fulfill a mission revealed by the higher order of the Holy Cross through revelation. The group's general purposes were to teach Christ without dogmatism or creedal stand, in order to bring about world brotherhood, and to establish brother houses, seminaries, missions, youth guidance centers, and clinics. The bylaws also declared that the movement was a non-sectarian order, teaching a universal approach to God, creation, and man, and that the group was non-political and would not fight or campaign against anyone. These non-sectarian, non-partisan, and universalist themes were to be a keynote of the early order and deserve closer scrutiny. A common characteristic of the NRMs that emerged in the San Francisco Bay Area during the 1960s was their tolerant attitude toward other spiritual groups and their eschewal of active participation in politics. The Happy Healthy Holy organization, 3HO for example, which busied itself with the creation of new social and spiritual patterns for the New Age, maintained courteous relations with other religious movements and taught that any preoccupation with institutions or politics was a misdirection of energy. In this regard, the Holy Order of Mans followed the prevailing pattern. From its inception, it refused to involve itself in partisan political activity or in public criticism of specific religious institutions. As Blyton's widow recalled, the subject was never discussed. He, Blyton, said, "We must never take a political stand, nor make political statements about political beliefs." Father also said we must never attack any religious belief, nor speak against another church or religion. This stance was clearly articulated in the new bylaws. No minister, priest, spiritual physician, or official of this order shall denounce or decry any religious organizations or philosophical group at any time. At no time shall any piece of literature be prepared which includes political or religious statements of any kind. Denouncements of any sect or creed, or statements for support of any nation shall not be made. This is a non-sectarian, non-national, non-political group. On the one hand, this non-partisan, non-sectarian stance simply followed in the tradition of genteel tolerance that had been part of California's religious style since the late 19th century. This style avoided political advocacy and refrained from defamatory statements against other religious groups. The judgment of 1960s commentators such as William Braden, however, is that the apolitical and tolerant ethos of the decade's NRMs was rooted in the counterculture's reaction to growing political violence and the disillusionment among activists at their inability to change the social order and to stop the Vietnam War. Citing a study of student activists at Berkeley by the sociologist James T. Carey, Braden noted a progression from political activism to political alienation to a search for ultimate meaning and the belief that the only change for which one can work is change within oneself. Blyton's nonpartisan, non-sectarian approach was also congruent with a growing ecumenical movement in mainline denominations nationwide, a movement with a long history to be sure, but one that seemed to gain increasing momentum following the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s. The eclectic, tolerant milieu of the San Francisco Bay Area was especially conducive to the spirit of ecumenism. From the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley Berkeley to Holy Names College in Oakland to the various interfaith organizations in San Francisco, forums appeared wherein members from different traditions could enter into open dialogue. An event that epitomized the Bay Area's ecumenical spirit was the ceremony establishing Esalen San Francisco branch in the fall of 1967. With the solemn majesty of Grace Cathedral as a backdrop, the Anglican Bishop James Pike, a Catholic nun of the Order of the Immaculate Heart, Michael Murphy, Abraham Maslow, Willis Harmon, B.F. Skinner, and Alan Watts, among others, joined in an evening of religious razzmatazz that included Buddhist, Hindu, and Gregorian chants, conga drums, Indian music, incense, and fire. These larger cultural trends, however, provide only a suggestive context for the order's apolitical and non-sectarian stances. Their deeper cause lies in Blyton's perennialist conception of religion. As articulated in his early writings, this conception posited an ancient wisdom tradition that had its roots in a golden age of the distant past. During that idealized primordium, humans were believed to have experienced conscious contact with divine beings, who openly taught them the great truths of science and religion. As the millennia passed, humankind became more and more enmeshed in materiality and lost its natural spiritual awareness. Civil governments began to detach themselves from religious ideals and to pursue power as an end in itself. To remedy these developments, teachers were sent from the spirit realms to create schools where selected candidates could be initiated into the ancient wisdom teachings and commissioned to reform corrupted human institutions. The specific articulation of these teachings, according to Blyton, was adapted to the culture and mentality of each region and period. For the student who focused upon a tradition's outer, exoteric form, its singularity, it indeed appeared incommensurate with other traditions, but for the student who saw beneath a tradition's outer form to its essential, esoteric content, it was revealed as a particular expression, needful given the circumstances of the one ancient wisdom. Blyton also claimed that the era of exclusivistic tribal-based religions was ending and that humankind, because of the planet-wide increase in the Christ light, was being forced to choose between a more unified global culture or planetary destruction. A universal way of light based on the all-encompassing brotherhood of man, he avowed, would be the religion of the future. This universal religion would be taught by a coming avatar, the next Christ, who would be born free from relationships with any organization, sect, religion, dogma, or movement. The work of cutting-edge religion in the New Age, therefore, would be to unify humanity by finding ways to surmount religious, political, and ethnic divisions. To foster such unification, the masters of the Great White Brotherhood were now drawing near in ever-increasing numbers to help their human brethren, and so prevent the complete destruction of the world. Blyton believed that this brotherhood had commissioned his order to teach the ancient wisdom in a manner that transcended human political and religious divisions and engendered global harmony. Sectarianism and partisan political activity had no place within such an enterprise. The bylaw's preamble also stated that the order would accomplish its purpose by establishing centers throughout the country where students would be trained in spiritual disciplines and charitable service. The group's service work would include aid to troubled youth, counseling, teaching, spiritual healing, street patrols, and public Sunday worship services. This combination of spiritual training and altruistic service would become the movement's calling card over its first decade of growth and ensure its public acceptance until the height of the anti-cult hysteria in the late 1970s. The tenets, as articulated in the bylaws, provide a useful starting point for an excursus on the order's basic teachings and practices. Tenet 2 speaks of tools given to the human race to fulfill its needs in this life and the one to come. The tools are specified as the law of the triangle and the spoken word. Since these were discussed in the earlier section on sacred symbolism, it is only necessary to re-emphasize the mental science tenor of the early order's teachings. According to Blyton, humans inhabit a universe in which God, mind, and matter exist as a unified field of consciousness and energy. Through the instrumentality of the human mind, which is a microcosm of the one all-encompassing cosmic mind, and the power of the spoken word in individuals are free to create whatever spiritual and material conditions they desire. As Tenet 13 put it, we accept man as an evolving being of unlimited resources and unlimited expansion. This monistic doctrine resonated with a long American tradition of idealist philosophies that is perhaps best exemplified by the late 19th century New Thought movement. As historian Richard Taylor recounts, New Thought preached a gospel of infinite possibilities through the creative power of constructive thinking and obedience to the voice of the indwelling presence. New Thought's earliest apostles considered themselves modern representatives of an ancient tradition of philosophical idealism, making them receptive to Oriental conceptions of religious truth with intuitive epistemologies and idealistic views of reality. New Thought teachers such as Ernest Holmes emphasized the scientific aspect of their religious philosophy and challenged students to test empirically their methods of affirmation and visualization. This approach understandably appealed to Blyton, an electrical engineer whose conception of spiritual growth was marked by an emphasis on method, technique, and efficacy. Like the anthroposophical educator Rudolf Steiner, Blyton saw himself as a teacher of spiritual science, the laws and techniques by which a person could master reality and attain physical and spiritual regeneration. Tenets 3 and 4 stated that the order accepted both a seen and an unseen plane of the life force, and that humans had been given spiritual as well as physical senses by the great creative intelligence. These traditional esoteric doctrines were the backdrop for the order's elaborate system of sacramental initiation. This system synthesized prayers and ritual forms revealed to Blyton with elements from Rosicrucianism, Roman and liberal Catholicism, Freemasonry, and Tantrism. The stated purpose of the initiations was to help a student function consciously in higher dimensions of awareness and gradually attain a complete alchemical regeneration of the physical body. Blyton's explications of these rites reflected his electrical engineering background and scientific approach to spirituality. They are dominated by a discourse of force, energy, vibration, wave, magnetism, and frequency. According to one expository treatise, the order's sacramental initiations were visible manifestations of God's plan of salvation and rituals of living symbolism that conferred upon the soul the effective potential for solar initiations. These solar initiations were understood as stages of soul development for all beings in the solar system. They moved the soul up the ladder of vibration and helped it gain greater purity and wisdom, virtues that would enable it to be a more effective servant of humanity. Through initiatory experience, a fresh organic germ of higher life was planted in the disciple's lower, older body. In time, this body would be fully regenerated, and the disciple would become a new creature with a body of light. The basic form and function of these sacraments, according to Blyton, had always existed on earth as part of the eternal path of humanity's evolution. For the most part, however, the rites had been available only to selected initiates in temples and mystery schools. Those conditions had changed with Jesus Christ's redemption and atonement, which set into motion a new pattern on earth through which all were invited to share in the mysteries. This new pattern was elaborated in the sacramental initiations of the early Christian Church, from which the 7 sacraments of Catholicism were purportedly derived. With the passing of time, the world had all but forgotten the true nature and function of these sacraments. part of the work of the Holy Order of Mans, in Blyton's view, would be to restore the alchemical basis of these sacramental forms by linking the mysteries of the ancient wisdom with the discoveries of modern science. This would provide a scientific spiritual foundation on which humans could grow to realize the divine self within them. The initial step in this restoration was to reconstitute the priestly hierarchy that Blyton believed he, as the Apostle Paul, had organized in the Christian communities of the first century. During that era, Paul, who according to Blyton was an initiate of the higher mysteries, had implanted the universal order of the priesthood into the growing body of the Christian community. Indeed, many of the early church fathers understood the intimate connection of the Christian church with the mystery schools of antiquity. These fathers also accepted the existence of a graded hierarchy of spiritual authority that reflected spiritual function and consciousness as well as material function and office. It was only during the reign of Constantine that the Catholic Church, in its war against Gnosticism, had begun a wholesale purge of the ancient mysteries from its doctrines. Though successful in this campaign, the Church had gradually lost sight of the exalted genealogy of its priesthood and the initiatory wisdom embedded in its sacramental forms. The priestly hierarchy of the Holy Order of Mans, Blyton declared, was being established to restore this wisdom to Christianity, thereby preparing Christian denominations to address the pressing spiritual needs of humanity in the dawning New Age. Blyton claimed that his authority to ordain priests had come through Jesus Christ himself by revelation. This was the same quality of authority, he believed, as that which had been granted him as Paul in the first century. In an essay on priestly ordination, Blyton wrote, "We do not argue or discuss it, we prove it by our actions and the fruits of our labors. The proof is there for anyone to see in the faces and bodies of our brothers and sisters, in the regeneration and illumination that is manifest in them." This appeal to demonstrations of charismatic power as proof of his ordaining authority had a powerful attraction for Blyton's early followers, most of whom were committed to the experience-centered ethos of the counterculture. In the years following his death, however, when such demonstrations became less frequent, this charismatically legitimated authority became a major source of instability within the movement. An elaborate rite of priestly ordination was formulated and refined during this period. The candidate undergoing this rite was first declared to be absolved of all past and future karma, and to be severed from all earthly ties. After accepting the rod of power, represented by either a 5-inch silver-colored metallic wand or a small piece of blackthorn, and a white cord used to gird the ordinand's new robe, as symbols of his new authority, the initiate professed an eternal vow of priestly service. The lights were then extinguished in the chapel except for a golden shaft of light that shone down on the blue-robed priest. Kneeling before Blyton, the candidate was given a gold ring inscribed with a circle, a triangle, and a square. The ring symbolized the priest's marriage to Christ, from everlasting to everlasting, in the service of the Almighty and Nameless One. The ceremony's final step was a proclamation of the new priest's status as a universal servant to all humanity, and a minister-priest in the Holy Order of Mans, under the divine order of Melchizedek. This elite body of initiates, also known as the Order of the Golden Cross, was understood to be a heavenly brotherhood of those who had dedicated themselves eternally to planetary service. Its members eschewed formal dogmas and creeds and were not tied to any church or organization or religion. Whether they served as priests in one of the Christian churches, as Buddhist monks, or as Tibetan lamas, their primary allegiance was to the great Christos, the Lord of the Sun. Blyton taught that this order was connected to an ancient priesthood that had existed from Adam to Moses, and that had been reconstituted by Christ in the first century. Its role in antiquity had been to catalyze spiritual regeneration in humanity through the proper teaching of spirit communication and the high art of priestly alchemy. A priest under the order of Melchizedek was declared to be one of Christ's elect who, though freed from the wheel of karma, had willingly allowed him or herself to be bound to the priesthood for 7 incarnations. It is worthwhile to note that Mormon founder Joseph Smith claimed a similar lineage after the order of Melchizedek for his priesthood. Smith and his followers believed that this ancient order of priests had been reinstated by Jesus, but had fallen into corruption after the apostolic period. The mission of the Mormon Church, they taught, was to restore the priestly order and its traditional function of administering ordinances. Historian D. Michael Quinn speculates that Smith might have learned of this order from the priestly practices of Pennsylvania's 18th century Ephrata commune, which had consecrated its leaders to the ancient order of Melchizedek by a laying on of hands. The attraction of such a lineal myth for a newly constituted independent priestly hierarchy is that it would tie the priesthood symbolically to the mysterious figure of Melchizedek, the biblical priest who was without father or mother or genealogy, and who had neither beginning of days nor end of life. By claiming membership in Melchizedek's exalted priesthood, to which the author of Hebrews claimed Jesus also belonged, a group could legitimize its hieratic authority not by a legal requirement concerning bodily descent or by connection to a particular religious institution, but rather by the power of an indestructible life. In short, legitimation could come by the demonstration of charismatic power. In his essay, The Cosmic Orders and Their Purposes, Blyton used excerpts from the Mormon Priesthood Manual to explain the mission of the Melchizedek priesthood. This hieratic order, he maintained, appeared in human history by God's revelatory fiat whenever it was needed. Given the urgent requirements of the dawning New Age, God had once again called into service his elite initiates through the auspices of the Holy Order of Mans. The evidence for this commission, Blyton asserted, was the revelatory and mystagogic charisma that was now emerging in the order's priesthood. Blyton insisted that the priests he ordained would be tied only temporarily to the Holy Order of Mans as an earthly institution. After 4 years of service within the Brotherhood, they could choose to work within established denominations or start their own churches. The order's founder believed that those he had initiated, like the leaven in the loaf, would slowly raise the other priesthoods of earth to a higher level of consciousness as the New Age unfolded. Part of this consciousness raising would entail teaching priests to administer sacramental rites properly so that participants could feel the actual existence and proximity of higher dimensions. This experience was the first step in learning to function productively in these dimensions, something that would be required of all who wish to live in the new heaven and new earth. The order's sacramental rites were understood as combinations of prayers, lights, incense, and other increments designed to move the creative powers of the Nameless One and bring down the spirit energy to a benefit of the recipient. These rites purportedly fixed in the psyche a visual symbol of particular principles and laws that later in life would draw experiences crucial to soul growth. The sacraments were also believed capable of reawakening significant experiences from past incarnations so that they need not be repeated in the present life. The first of these rites, called baptism, Tenet 8, was interpreted as one of 3 fundamental steps on the universal path of initiation. The other 2 steps, echoing Subramania's teaching, were termed illumination and realization. In baptism, an aspirant declared his or her dedication to the way of spiritual regeneration under the guidance of the cosmic Christ. Blyton stressed that this dedication was to Christ and not to any church, sectarian group, or order. Order members believed that when properly administered, the rite triggered the infusion of the Christ force, the cosmic solar current carrying the light, into the disciple's body. It also set into motion the magnetic forces of the earth, the lunar current. This activation of solar and lunar forces was believed to purge the body of the effects of past error, so that it could begin to assimilate the higher vibrations of the Christ light. The baptismal ceremony itself was a model of solemnity and simplicity. After a period spent in solitary retrospection, the initiate was encouraged to confess past errors to the minister priest. The priest then anointed the crown of the student's head with consecrated oil and said, "Pass into this body, Father, through thy Son, the great Christos. Bring this child into the cosmic consciousness for its life of service." This step was believed to open the crown chakra of the initiate so that an infusion of the Christ force could take place. Next, the baptized was asked, "Do you now give yourself into the arms of Christ?" To which he or she responded, "I do." After this dedication, the priest dipped his thumb and index and middle fingers into the oil and passed them over the crown again in the form of a cross, pronouncing the consecration of the soul to Christ. From that day forward, the student was believed to be under the mantle of Jesus Christ. His radiant persona extended out to shelter his disciples in his or her initiatory journey. Sometimes at this juncture a spiritual name was received by the priest and given to the kneeling disciple. In the final part of the ritual, the physical senses of the initiate were blessed with holy water so that he or she might begin to receive impressions from the other realms of creation. After this ablution, Psalm 23 was read, and the ceremony ended with a Trinitarian benediction. The sacrament of communion, Tenet 7, was considered the foundation of the order's daily spiritual practice. It was served at 6:15 a.m., Monday through Saturday, and in the late morning on Sunday. The entire rite was understood as a work of spiritual alchemy in which the bread and wine were transmuted into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. When properly performed, it was believed to literally infuse the qualities, experience, and attributes of the great Master Jesus into the body of the communicant, slowly transforming his entire being into the goal of evolution, the God-man in a Christed humanity. In order to grasp the sacrament's mode of operation, it is necessary to consider briefly Blyton's somewhat unconventional Christology. The order's founder understood Christ, against the backdrop of his idea of God as the impersonal totality of the universe and its energies, to be the Lord of the Sun, a being from a different humanity who had lowered himself into the earthly body of the Master Jesus to bring about the raising of humankind's consciousness. This great solar Lord had manifested itself through various avatars, but never to the degree it had through Jesus. Blyton taught that the incarnation occurred during the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan River. At that point, the solar Lord and the human Jesus became one God-man. During his ministry, this being was believed to have taught and demonstrated the way to self-mastery and spiritual enlightenment. At the crucifixion, Jesus Christ's spirit and blood were envisioned as having entered the earth, permeating it with his consciousness and his atmosphere and the energy of his being. Jesus' soul and the initiatory experience it contained were then understood to have become co-extensive with the oversoul of Earth, which Blyton taught had the same relation to the planetary orb as the human soul had to the physical body. It was because this oversoul contained the life experience and transcendent abilities of Christ, and because one could partake of it through the order's communion rite, that humanity was now considered free to follow in the footsteps of its elder brother. The potential attainment for the aspiring disciple was limitless, for as Blyton was often heard to quote from John 14:12, "He who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works than these will he do, because I go to the Father." Blyton's personal library contained a number of works that emphasized these more cosmic and Gnostic conceptions of Christ. Among the titles were H. Spencer Lewis's The Mystical Life of Jesus, George Maloney's The Cosmic Christ, Teilhard de Chardin's The Phenomenon of Man, and John Fernand's The Mystical Christ. In the early 1970s, the Blytons would distill what they considered to be essentials of these writings and publish them as the 3-volume books of the Master Jesus. The communion rite itself was received in a 1967 revelation through Blyton at his DuBose Avenue office. It began with an opening prayer by the presiding priest, followed by a reading from the New Testament. The priest then knelt before the altar and prayed for a complete purgation of body and mind, so that he or she might be filled completely with the light of Christ. This prayer of absolution was then extended to the whole congregation, which recited in unison the Lord's Prayer. Next, the priest took the paten containing the unleavened matzah bread and pronounced the words of transmutation. Blyton taught that every time a priest pronounced this formula, he or she was transmuting a little bit more of earth's substance into the divine substance of the body of Christ. The chalice of wine was then lifted in the air, and the Holy Trinity was invoked to transform the essence of earth and heaven, the wine, into the blood of the most glorious Lord of earth, Jesus Christ. Because this blood was believed to carry the actual experience and vitality of Christ, the partaking of it was seen to infuse these powers into the consciousness of the receptive communicant. Before serving the kneeling assembly, the priest partook of the consecrated bread and wine and prayed to become the transformed and transfigured Lord Jesus Christ, to administer the communion. In this solemn act of sacramental mediumship, the priest was believed to have assumed the Christ nature completely. It was thus the Christ consciousness that overshadowed the celebrant as he or she administered communion to the congregation. At this point in the rite, the priest sometimes received a word of advice or comfort that would be whispered to the kneeling communicant. When all had received communion, the priest returned to the altar, offered up the sins of the people that they might be transformed into the light of Christ, and closed the ceremony with a benediction. Whereas baptism represented the neophyte's initial decision to follow the way, and communion offered daily spiritual nourishment, it was Blyton's signature initiations of illumination and self-realization that were seen to constitute the disciple's essential preparation for the new age. As one former teacher explained, the time had come when the vibration of the earth was going to raise drastically, and only those who had accommodated themselves to higher states of vibration and energy would really be able to cope with this. As a result of it, the raising of the earth's vibration, there would be a great deal of psychic dislocation and distress within the populace. Only those people who were illuminated, who were initiated into and had control of their faculties in this state, would be of service to the population, because they would be able to keep their wits about them and understand what was going on, and help people make this transition by initiating thousands in a day. The vision was to be there as centers of light, so that when the time of crisis came, we would be ready to help. Time was of the essence, since the illumination of the planet, when the psychic world would merge with the physical world, was believed underway. Blyton's plan was to bring as many people as possible into the light, thereby ameliorating the upheavals and disorientations that would likely accompany the planet's lift in vibration. This millenarian sense of urgency was intensified by the radical crisis and revolutionary changes that were occurring not only in San Francisco but worldwide in the late 1960s. In the rite of illumination, the new body of light, which was believed to be attuned to the higher frequencies of the New Age, was thought to be implanted and sealed in the initiate's physical body. Although the exact procedures for this initiation were kept secret, a general idea of what took place can be constructed from the priest's instruction manual and from the testimony of former initiates. The rite usually occurred after evening prayers, because the magnetic forces of the earth were much stronger at night, and this would help the individual see the light more clearly. After meditating for several hours in the chapel, the initiate knelt before the altar, and Blyton put his hands over the student's solar plexus and lower back, creating a potential for the light to be attracted to. This had the reported effect of building up an electrical charge that awakened the spiritual energy, called kundalini, stored at the base of the spine, and activated the body's chakra circuits. At this point, some initiates reported seeing a luminous column inside themselves and experiencing an influx of energy throughout their body. The newly illumined member would spend the next day in seclusion, assimilating the higher energies that were felt to be coursing through him. Several past initiates recalled that after their illumination they could see auras of light around people and objects and feel a qualitative difference in themselves. There was also a noticeable difference in the person's countenance. As one ex-member reported, "I saw people change. The next day his or her face was different. You'd see that person and you'd say, 'Hey, it really happened.'" In a 1971 revelation, the change was proclaimed to be permanent. Illumination is a matter of receiving light and then letting go, until your complete body is full of light, until you have so much light that you can never see darkness. Blyton found an analog for this initiatory experience in the Transfiguration story of the Gospels. When the teacher seals the light in you, this begins the process of regeneration until we and all of life are transfigured. The rite of self-realization was even more mysterious than that of illumination. As pieced together from interviews and from references in Blyton's writings, it appears that this initiation was a neo-shamanic rending of an etheric veil that was perceived to surround the indwelling spark of divinity in a person called the self. Once this veil had been removed, a person was believed able to see a luminous globe or point of light at the center of their being. Directly following this initiation, the student remained in silent meditation for 3 days in the chapel. From that time onward, the realized being was considered empowered to go within and receive revelation from the Godhead itself. These grades of initiation were reflected in the movement's internal organization by a hierarchy that sharply delineated lines of authority and function. This general structure, common in initiatory groups and religious orders, ensured that all members had a clear understanding of their individual roles and duties. Sacred authority in this framework was mediated by the office of the Director General and passed down through subordinate offices to the group's rank and file. In a neo-Gnostic movement like the Order, the person occupying the office of Director General was believed to have the highest grade of spiritual understanding and power. Others in the movement had knowledge and status relative to their proximity and attunement to this Master Knower. Director General Blyton sat at the head of the Esoteric Council. This body, which consisted of every minister priest in the movement, maintained the Order's manual of discipline and curriculum, and pronounced final judgment on matters related to the membership's welfare. A board of directors and its appointed officers, the president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer, administered the Brotherhood's temporal affairs. The Director General served as a liaison between the board and the Esoteric Council and had the power to veto any measure or bill or rule passed by these bodies when the good of the order was deemed to be threatened. This veto power made the Director General the dominant authority in the movement. The director's authority was further enhanced as the group expanded outside California by the stipulation that the central headquarters of the order would be wherever the Director General resided. Since the Esoteric Council and the Board of Directors could be convened only at this central headquarters, the Director General would always be at the Brotherhood's spiritual and legal center, able to direct every aspect of the order's functioning. The next level of authority under the Director General was the Master Teacher, a priest to whom Blyton had devoted special training and who was believed to be a fully functioning member of the White Brotherhood. These apostles of the movement wore sanctuary robes of white linen or silk and crosses made of black onyx set in a gold border and hung from a purple ribbon. As the order expanded throughout the United States, these teachers became the Directors General of apostleships, consisting of all Brotherhood centers located within a particular geographical region. Under the Master Teachers were minister priests, stewards, disciples, students, and novices. Minister priests served as Esoteric Council members, instructors, spiritual counselors, celebrates of the sacraments, and head administrators of branch centers. They wore black clerical garb while on the street and wine-red robes indoors. Their crosses, from which the corpus had been carefully removed, were made of wood and steel. A steward was a member who was responsible for carrying out the general business of a branch center. This included purchasing, paying bills, organizing kitchen schedules, and supervising repair work. A disciple was a brother or sister who had taken life vows and thus become entitled to complete financial support from the order's general fund. In return, this member contributed all earnings to and held all possessions in common with the brotherhood. The disciple wore black clerical garb at all times outside the brother house, and a blue ribbon on his or her Roman collar delineating non-priestly status. Inside the brother house, he or she wore a powder blue robe. A student was a probationary member who had taken first vows, humility, service, obedience, purity, and poverty, that were binding for 6 months. The student could go on street patrols and was permitted weekend liberty on Saturdays from 1 to 11 p.m. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the novices, beginning students who had taken a vow of obedience to the group's priesthood that was binding until further commitment or departure from the aegis of the order. In practice, novices were usually under this vow for at least 3 months. Upon entry, they were restricted to the brother house for a period of 30 days to cleanse the novice's atmosphere of worldliness, and allowed no leaves of absence on weekends. After the 30-day restriction, the newcomers were permitted the same weekend privileges as students, provided they were accompanied by a vowed member. During their probationary period, the recruits were not permitted to wear clerical garb and did not go on street patrols. If they found outside jobs and chose to donate their earnings to the order, they would be given room and board, schooling, complete health and welfare benefits, clothing, and any other necessities. While providing the security of knowing one's exact role and status in the order community, this hierarchical structure stood in the direct contradiction to the counterculture's egalitarian, libertarian, and anti-authoritarian ethos. Observers of the era's NRMs, many of which had a similar authoritarian governance, have sought to account for this contradiction by stressing the acute anomie that prevailed among counterculture youths. They posit that the discipline and order of authoritarian religious systems provided many of these youths with a welcome antidote to their chaotic and confused psychosocial existence. With its corporate structure now in place, the order was through its first major cycle of expansion, reporting 210 vowed members by the time of its 1969 annual meeting. As one member recalled, "When I first met him, Blyton, in late 1968, there were about 20 people who were living with him. Then it went to hundreds. All of a sudden it just blew open, and we were scrambling to find ways to organize things and to find property and places for people to live. It was a crazy whirlwind, dynamic thing. Charismatic manifestations abounded, a common occurrence in religious movements during their founding period, and would become the stuff of legend for later recruits. Chief among these manifestations was the general atmosphere that seemed to hang in the air around order centers. One resident from these days commented, "The testimony over and over again of people who would come is that they could feel a tangible, palpable, experiential dynamism to the atmosphere of the order. They walked into it and it floored them. They would describe it as a very high energy or a very strong psychic force." A former student, now a priest in an order spin-off organization, recalled of Blyton that his presence was the most extraordinary thing. As long as you were open and letting go, life was just one long extraordinary experience, one long piece of revelation, almost impossible to deal with because it just never let up. For some students, the atmosphere of the brother houses had a regenerative, protective dimension that involved the white brotherhood. Everyone that entered the order in those days experienced a light, power, and regeneration in their own bodies that they could not deny. The name Army of God comes to mind because we were part of the White Brotherhood. There were brothers that you could not see physically that were walking with you everywhere throughout your day. You were constantly in the presence of God. It was like a mantle, a cloak surrounding you, protecting you, and inspiring you to reach out and help others. At times during classes, Blyton would slip into a trance-like condition, and a voice believed to be that of the Master Jesus would teach through him for the evening. These occurrences left a deep impression on those who witnessed them. As one priest recounted, "I was there one time when Jesus came and talked through him. The energy level went up about 10 notches. There was so much light in that room, golden light, that it was almost physically unbearable to be there. Everything was golden at that point. The walls were, the people were. You looked at your own flesh and it had a golden color to it." Another priest had a similar recollection. "The one time I remember very vividly that a revelation came through was when we were in the middle of a class and Father was talking about soul, and all of a sudden he just stopped and you could see his eyes going blank. He slumped forward and his voice changed and said, 'Father Paul is not with you at this time. He will be back. This is Jesus.' And then he went into the revelation, and Father came back, and he wasn't sure what happened from the way he was acting. It was so intense it was visual, the energy that was in the room, and the sense of holiness. These charismatic manifestations, seemingly incredible at first to many who observed them, in time became comprehensible within the context of the order's prevailing self-understanding. If the Brotherhood was indeed a recapitulation of the early apostolic community, it only followed that Jesus would be present in its midst as teacher and guide. Blyton's early students remembered other manifestations of his paranormal, neo-shamanic abilities. In some, Blyton walked through walls or appeared suddenly in a room. In others, he escorted students into other dimensions of awareness where they had long conversations with spirit beings. Many recalled seemingly miraculous healings that had occurred. On one such occasion, an ex-junkie had awakened one morning to find that his arms were completely free of needle marks. It was common practice during this period for students to kneel at the altar after evening prayers and to receive blessings by the laying on of hands. At times, respondents claimed the walls literally shook during these blessings, and persons would be seen levitating in the air. This atmosphere of spontaneous charismatic manifestations was augmented by the order's style of preaching, which minimized formal preparation and admonished priests to let go and allow the Spirit to speak through them during worship services. Blyton's method of training between 1967 and 1969 was more a kind of apprenticeship than any set course of classes. As one former student put it, that was a lot of the training. Being around Father and being called into that privy experience with him, or just sitting up there with him and Sam Lewis, getting in on those conversations, like the teacher-student relationships of old. It wasn't anything formalized or laid down in a curriculum, but more assimilation in the milieu of daily life. Another ex-student commented, "My relationship with Father Paul was a mystical relationship. We communicated non-verbally. That's how he worked with me, telepathically. He never sat down and had a discussion with me per se. Rather, he would bring me into his consciousness. At times, Blyton would take a student out for a walk and teach through example. I remember a lot of times," one priest recounted, "we used to walk downtown from 20 Steiner, and he just gave away money. People would come along and take advantage of the help. It did not make any difference. He said, 'What you're doing it for is for the people that you do help.' The order's director seemed to take a special pleasure in this form of service, for even when his organization had grown fairly large, he would reportedly go out for walks on Sunday afternoons and sit down on the curb and help a total stranger or pass out money to derelicts. Blyton appears to have been unconcerned with originality of thought or presentation in his teachings, as one priest remarked. He didn't put himself forward as an originator of any of this. His view was that this was all part of the tradition. Nobody had ownership. Truth is truth, and use what you can. There was a large file cabinet in his office filled with Rosicrucian New Thought, Christian Science, Theosophical, and other writings. Before composing his own course of lessons in the late 1960s, he would often send students to look through his material and pick out whatever they thought of interest. If he found a good idea, another priest recalled, he wouldn't have any trouble borrowing it. William Bainbridge has argued that this mode of operation is fairly common for the founders of NRMs in the 20th century. He notes that these movements tend to cluster in family lineages, and that the originator of a new group often takes the cultural configuration of an existing organization, removes some components, and replaces them with other components taken from other sources. Innovation in this process does not require the discovery of wholly new facts or concepts, but only a new configuration of familiar elements taken piecemeal from other religious organizations and secular institutions. It has already been suggested to what extent Blyton borrowed from the Subramania Order, Freemasonry, AMORC, New Thought, and Roman Catholicism. His originality thus lay not so much in the content of his teachings as in his recombination of doctrines from the Western esoteric tradition, with tantric initiatory practices, Roman Catholic sacramental forms, and organizational structures from traditional religious orders. In this regard, it is noteworthy that by the late 1960s, Blyton had become highly enthusiastic about Francis Thompson's early 20th century biography of Ignatius Loyola. He had this book, which had long been out of print, photocopied and passed out to a number of his students. The work's depiction of a disciplined order of spiritual knights observing a common method of contemplative training, Ignatius's spiritual exercises, and entrusted with a mission crucial to the survival of Christianity, greatly appealed to Blyton. As one priest recalled, he wanted to reverse the 7 ecumenical councils in the sense that Gnosticism, the real Christianity, had been suppressed, and he was looking to counterattack, and this order of his was his Jesuits, his freelancers, who were going to go forth and enter the fray and hold the banner high. It would be one of the great ironies of this counterattack that its own generals, after Blyton's death, would contravene his battle plan and become the self-proclaimed defenders of Orthodox Christianity. As mentioned earlier, reincarnation was a foundational element of the nascent order's sense of mission and identity. According to Blyton, this ancient Christian mystery had been openly accepted by the early church, but suppressed by later ecumenical councils. The reason for this suppression, in his view, was the church's fear that its members would have less zeal for their religious duties if they felt that they had the luxury of more than one lifetime within which to attain salvation. The order's founder rarely spoke about the actual mechanics or science of reincarnation, insisting that it was difficult to teach in a conceptual way. As one former priest recalled, he made it clear that it was a reality, but it can only be experienced. He talked about it because he wanted people to know that it was part of the creative evolution of souls, that they had different lessons to learn each time they came into a body, that perfection like that embodied by Jesus was far beyond one lifetime to achieve. For many recruits, the order's acceptance of reincarnation proved it was more than just a warmed-over version of the churchianity of their childhoods. Although the doctrine had circulated through America's occult underground since the days of the 19th century, Theosophists, it had gained widespread currency only with the counterculture's exploration of Eastern religious traditions during the 1960s. A number of the decade's NRMs accepted reincarnation as part of their worldviews, including ISKCON, the Divine Light Mission, the Integral Yoga Center, the Meher Baba Society, the Ananda Cooperative Fellowship, the Summit Lighthouse, and 3HO. By the late 1960s, the doctrine had become a staple element in the personal cosmologies of many young seekers. Any spiritual group that did not accept this teaching was seen as obviously flawed. Although the conviction that they were literally working among the first disciples of Christ generated a sense of excitement and self-importance in early order members, the belief did have its drawbacks. As might be expected in a group of youthful personalities, an inordinate amount of time was spent in speculation concerning members' past life identities. At times these speculations moved into the realm of the absurd, such as when a person who had been identified as a glorious person of the past, say St. Peter, disappeared unceremoniously from the order after 6 months of membership. Finally, according to one member, Blyton felt compelled to speak out on the issue. He reminded his students that reincarnation, while a reality, was not integral to their present spiritual development. He was adamant, the member recalled, about not getting sidetracked by such phenomena, but staying centered on Jesus' teachings and the illumination and what you're doing now. In sermons and classes, Blyton also lampooned his students' proclivity to recall only incarnations in which they had been some exalted personage. With its sudden increase in recruitment and income between the summer of 1968 and the summer of 1969, the Brotherhood was able to buy property and send out missionary teams to other states. The first property to be purchased outright was at 910 Steiner Street. In December 1968, Matthew Lippa and a corps of brothers moved into the house and began its renovation. Within a year it had become the sister house where women recruits spent their novitiate. In early 1969, a community building on Potrero Street was donated temporarily to the order through the good graces of Ella Rigney and the Episcopal Church. After extensive remodeling, 8 brothers moved in and began performing service work in the surrounding brotherhood. In March of 1969, Blyton worked out an arrangement with the Urban Planning Commission to rent for a nominal fee an old hotel on Fillmore Street until its eventual demolition. After a complete renovation, the Fillmore Aid Station opened its doors and began to provide free meals and lodging for local indigents. This Salvation Army-like facility was situated in the heart of the Fillmore district's toughest neighborhood, directly above a subterranean shooting range used by street gangs. The brothers cooked and baked bread for the morning and evening meals, while a live-in priest served communion and helped residents find jobs. Vacant rooms in the hotel were used to store donated clothing that was distributed periodically to the neighborhood's needy. Some of the students working with the residents had only recently joined the order themselves after spending a few days in the aid station detoxifying. Ex-directors of the shelter recalled stories of daily dousings with Lysol and of evening searches to get all the marijuana and whatever else people brought in out. The aid station was eventually placed under the supervision of the order's first African-American priest, John Clark, who helped make peace with the local Black Panthers. The novices who joined the movement in 1969 and 1970 came from a wider array of backgrounds than Blyton's earliest recruits, most of whom had been young white indigents from the Tenderloin and Haight looking for a better life and a way to survive. The newer members including blue-collar ex-alcoholics, cowboys from Montana, a black pugilist from Reno, Nevada, a few Asians, an Eskimo, a Hawaiian, intellectuals, Vietnam vets, some clergy that were disillusioned with the traditional churches, and several bankers and accountants. According to one respondent, these newer recruits were of a similar character type. They were rebels and pioneers who felt the order really provided a vehicle for their growth and relished the fact that it wasn't a traditional type of path. A former priest agreed with this assessment and added, "One of the things that I think typifies them is that they never quit looking in a serious sort of way. They were not people who went into the guru supermarket and picked a little of this and a little of that off the shelf. They wanted something substantial." Blyton particularly cherished a subcategory of this type, the outcasts of society, who had been beaten in every game they had ever tried, and yet who had never stopped fighting. As one confidant put it, he, Blyton, used to tell me, "Give me one person that will take a chance, even though it doesn't turn out right, over 10 of these people who just want to be good, and it showed in the kind of people that he brought into his inner circle. They were all fairly strong and rebellious, but they wouldn't take no for an answer. This same confidant also speculated that Blyton's attraction to this personality type may have related to the director's image of himself. I believe his personal myth, the driving image of his life, was the hero. He saw himself alone, further out on the edge, driving harder against greater odds to accomplish greater deeds than anyone. A man of this kind would naturally seek out others who were willing, often at great personal sacrifice, to embrace his heroic mission. The recruits from middle-class backgrounds were often forced to rub shoulders with a wider cross-section of humanity than they had previously encountered. As one worker at the Fillmore aid station recalled, in the course of 2.5 months we had 6 older, middle-aged men that came in. All of them had drinking problems. One day I was over at the Fillmore house, and there was this alcoholic who had not drunk in 3 days, and he was having a seizure. He was wreathing around, and there was a brother just praying over him. 3 days later he was a novice in the bed next to me. That's the way Father Paul worked. He really brought them in, and these guys became pretty staunch sort of instant missionaries, instant Christians, instant clergy. There was a smaller percentage of women than men in the order until at least 1972. Women recruits were generally from upper middle class backgrounds and had at least some post-secondary education. The majority of male recruits also had some college education. As Rodney Stark has argued, cult movements which, unlike sectarian movements, arise independently of conventional religious institutions, often involve an original set of ideas and thus appeal to people who have had a relatively sophisticated exposure to sources of information about new cultural developments, i.e. have some college education. In survey research, Stark also discovered that prospective recruits with some degree of university education are especially likely to have lost faith in conventional churches and to be open to new religious systems. The religious background of recruits during this period was approximately 50% Roman Catholic, 35% Protestant, and 15% Jewish. The movement had 3 features that made it particularly attractive to those reared as Catholics. 1, its ceremonial and sacerdotal dimensions, which resonated with Catholic ritualism. 2, its appropriation of Catholic religious garb and monastic practices. And 3, its hierarchical priesthood and governing structure. 4 individual stories of conversion from this period are typical. John McCaffrey was a native of Berkeley who had grown up in a family of Christian scientists in Oakland. His father was the executive vice president of a company that manufactured large ship engines, and his mother was a district coordinator for Vista. After an adolescence during which he had published a volume of beat poetry and frequented the coffee houses of San Francisco's North Beach, McCaffrey attended St. John's, an experimental college in Santa Fe, New Mexico, built around a great books curriculum. After spending a 1.5 years studying Western intellectual history and playing in a jug band, McCaffrey met several missionaries of the new counterculture and was lured to the Haight-Ashbury. There he experimented with psychedelics, ran in circles that included the digger Emmett Grogan, and helped organize the first be-in at Golden Gate Park. McCaffrey then joined the flood of hippies who were moving to Marin and Sonoma counties in late 1967 to escape the Haight's disintegrating street scene. He lived briefly at the infamous Morning Star commune of Lou Gottlieb before settling in the San Geronimo Valley, where he worked as a tree topper. Plagued by a growing sense of purposelessness, the 22-year-old McCaffrey sought help from psychiatric counselors and friends, none of whom proved to be able to solve his quandary. On Christmas Eve, 1968, he drove his live-in truck, complete with wood stove, to San Francisco to deliver a handmade gift to a woman friend. After searching in several locations, he was directed to her new address at 20 Steiner Street. When he arrived at the center, McCaffrey was told his friend was not yet home and asked if he would like to wait for her inside. The young hippie accepted the offer and, after sitting for a time in a living room furnished with 1950s dentist office decor, was taken to the basement to help distribute shoes and clothing to needy Fillmore residents. When his friend returned, he gave her the gift and accepted her invitation to meet Blyton in his second-floor office. As he was walking up the stairs, McCaffrey later recounted, he began to experience a mounting euphoric feeling that left him barely able to breathe. By the time he had reached the second-floor landing, his friend then introduced him to her teacher, whereupon McCaffrey sat down and began to sob uncontrollably. After pulling himself together, the embarrassed young man made an offhand comment about having read the Bible and having found Jesus to be a great guy. Without warning, and with a complete disregard for social niceties, Blyton, who had been silent up to this point, thundered, "I don't give a damn if he was a great guy. Does it work?" McCaffrey, a man not given to displays of emotional vulnerability, again collapsed into tears. The meeting was then interrupted by a knock at the door announcing dinner, to which McCaffrey was invited. Later that evening, in a state of joyful consternation, the young man bade farewell to his friends and co-workers. The following morning he returned to Steiner Street and was accepted as a novice. In time, McCaffrey became the movement's director of spiritual education, a master teacher, and by 1989 an Orthodox priest serving a church in Syracuse, New York. Tom Steinfeld was born in 1942 in Wilmette, Illinois, of upper-middle-class non-religious Jewish parentage. After his psychiatrist father committed suicide in Switzerland, Steinfeld, who was 13 at the time, underwent an extensive period of psychotherapy. He then studied existentialist philosophy at Northwestern and Roosevelt universities, but dropped out before graduation to join the San Francisco counterculture. After experimenting with hallucinogens, attending Esalen encounter groups, and studying Eastern mysticism with Alan Watts, Steinfeld returned to Illinois in 1968 to live with his mother. A childhood friend, Michael Schuler, came home from San Francisco during the Christmas holidays and told him about a mystical order he had joined the previous July. After a long discussion, Schuler arranged for Steinfeld to fly out to San Francisco and move into the new brother house at 910 Steiner Street, despite the fact that Steinfeld had never met or heard of Blyton. Schuler left the group a short time later and went on to become a professor of psychology at California State University, Fresno. Steinfeld, whom Blyton adopted as one of his cherished projects, left and re-entered the order on several occasions before being hospitalized with mental illness. After successful treatment, he moved to Milwaukee, Oregon, where he now lives on a government disability pension. Ligeia Borgia was reared in a devout Roman Catholic family of Costa Rican ancestry in San Diego. She joined the youth counterculture in the late 1960s and was living a nomadic lifestyle with her husband in Northern California when she was invited by a friend one day to meet Blyton and his wife. After some small talk, during which Borgia took of her intention to take a 3-week spiritual retreat in the mountains, Blyton explained what the order was and made her an offer. "You're welcome to try this out, no strings attached. If you don't like it, you can walk out the door." Figuring she had nothing to lose, Borgia accepted Blyton's offer and was soon settled at 910 Steiner Street. As she later recounted, Blyton called her into his office one evening to discuss her misgivings regarding the group's unusual teachings. After taking a seat in the middle of the room, the energy around her suddenly became incandescent, and she found herself in another dimension that she intuitively believed was the planet Venus. Blyton told her that this had been her home before coming to Earth. It was like something out of a science fiction movie. It was the memory of knowing where I had been before I came here, and how I came here. He said that we'd been there together before we came to Earth. This and similar experiences helped overcome her doubts concerning the authenticity of Blyton's teachings. Borgia became a priest in 1972, but left the group shortly after Blyton's death in 1974. By 1989, she had remarried and moved with her husband and 4 children to a farm in Costa Rica. Mary Kaminsky grew up in a small town in Illinois where her Polish father worked as a plumber. A devout Missouri Synod Lutheran throughout her early teen years, she began to reject conservative Lutheranism when her family was excommunicated from the local church because of her father's alcoholism. Kaminsky attended Purdue University for 2.5 years, but dropped out after a semester of drug experimentation. She returned home to live with her by then divorced mother and began studying Eastern mysticism and Hatha yoga. In response to what she experienced as a persistent interior guidance at the end of 1969, Kaminsky informed her friends that she was moving to San Francisco. The young woman's shocked mother asked her to wait until she could arrange a job for her through friends in California. She was able to do this within a short time and even bought her daughter a small Volkswagen for the trip. The day after Kaminsky arrived in San Francisco, she began her job as a clerical worker. The employee seated at her right, she remembered, had this glow around her and was wearing a large cross around her neck. After some initial questioning, the woman invited Kaminsky to dinner at 20 Steiner Street and to a ballet. The 21-year-old Midwesterner soon became a regular visitor to the sister house at 910 Steiner Street, where she ate meals and attended public classes. One day at work, she received a phone call from her mother. After hanging up, Kaminsky felt strangely alienated from both her After hanging up, Kaminsky felt strangely alienated from both her family and her fellow employees. She began to cry uncontrollably and was excused from work for the day. The co-worker from the order suggested that Kaminsky go to 20 Steiner Street for counseling. Upon arriving, the distraught young woman was asked by the priest on duty what she was planning to do about her predicament. With tears still streaming down her face, she responded, "Well, I guess I have to join." That evening she collected her belongings and moved into the sister house. Kaminsky became a priest in 1972 and was part of the order's first missionary team to Holland in 1977. The mother of 4 has since taken a master's degree in psychology at the University of Amsterdam. Each of these recruits encountered fairly primitive living conditions at the early order's San Francisco centers. Furnishings in the houses were either donations or thrift store chic, and the sleeping quarters were wall-to-wall beds. The daily diet consisted for the most part of brown rice and vegetables, and baking soda was used in place of toothpaste. Clothing was shared communally, and the house robes were a hodgepodge of different patterns and fabrics. Training for this second wave of recruits consisted of cooking and house cleaning, nightly classes, street patrols, and Sunday volunteer work in the psychiatric ward of Laguna Honda Hospital. The life of a novice was highly restricted, only spiritual reading material was allowed, and contacts with friends and family were kept to a minimum. These latter restrictions would soon ease in the wake of criticism by unhappy parents, but they were initially justified as necessary to wean the novice away from the world. With the rapid increase of students between 1969 and 1970, Blyton decided to formulate a more systematic approach to member indoctrination. Drawing upon a wide array of esoteric and New Thought teachings, he wrote the Tree of Life Lessons, billed as a comprehensive study of the ancient Christian mysteries. The course was divided into 4 levels: Bible Interpretation, Level 1, Universal Tools of Man, Level 2, The Sciences of Man, Level 3, and The Golden Dawn, Level 4. The Level 1 lessons covered such New Thought topics as Word, Mind, Prayer, and Blessing. They also articulated the order's spiritual anthropology, which taught that humans consist of the self, or spark of divinity at the core of consciousness, the soul, or etheric sheath surrounding the self, the spiritual or vital body, and the physical body. At a certain stage on a person's evolutionary journey, the lessons asserted he or she awakened to the reality of the self and began a return to the feast of oneness with God. In between levels 1 and 2, the student read short synopses of the world's basic religions and brief biographies of the great teachers of history. All religions, the lessons claimed, were extensions of one another and pathways to God. When pursued to their full extent, they opened out onto the way, the universal path under the dominion of the Great White Brotherhood. The essential truths of all religions were held to be in agreement once the trimmings of incidental ritual, opinion, and dogma had been removed. The traditions studied included Hinduism, Judaism, Jainism, Confucianism, Zen Buddhism, Sufism, Zoroastrianism, American Protestantism, Roman Catholicism, Ancient Apostolic Christianity, and Western monasticism. The teachers covered included were the pre-Socratic philosophers of Greece, Socrates, Buddha, Plotinus, Amenhotep IV, St. Patrick, Muhammad, and Nikon the Patriarch of Moscow. In Level 2, the student investigated such tools of man as symbolism, epigenesis, the law of spiritual momentum, communication, and the law. In Level 3, the sciences of the material world were considered together with the spiritual sciences. The course headings included physics, chemistry, astrology, color, sound, concentration, the art of seeing, the development of vision in other dimensions of consciousness, psychic body, Aquarian body, the body of light thought necessary for the coming new age, physiology, race evolution, and transcendent art. The Level 4 Golden Dawn lessons included advanced training in spiritual healing and esoteric philosophy, and were intended to prepare the student for a healer's license and Doctor of Divinity degree. In addition to completing the Tree of Life curriculum, members were required to study the New Testament, the first 3 chapters of Genesis, the Quran, and the Bhagavad Gita. They also took a course in Hebrew philosophy that was derived from the Kabbalistic and tarot investigations of Paul Foster Case, an esoterist and former member of the American Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Ruth Blyton adapted Case's tarot representations to the order's teachings and created a new tarot deck. Students taking her classes on symbolism were required to paint each of this deck's 22 higher arcana according to a specific color schema. According to an ex-priest, the theory behind this training was that tarot images were a kind of pictorial representation of the phases through which all souls evolved on their way to God realization. Within this conceptual framework, each card was used to help a student grasp the deeper significance of the spiritual experiences they were undergoing during their training. Earl Blyton's vision of a New Age mystery school is clearly discernible in the Tree of Life's eclectic curriculum, with its Rosicrucian theosophical marriage of religion and science, and its blend of mysticism, esotericism, and the study of traditional religious scriptures. Because of its expanding street ministries and unconventional appearance, the order began to attract the attention of local underground newspapers. In the spring of 1969, a cover story on the movement ran in the San Francisco Oracle. This news organ, billed as the world's only psychedelic newspaper, had appeared in September 1966 and quickly gained an international readership because of its exotic portrayal of Haight-Ashbury culture. The newspaper carried articles on the new sciences of astrology, acupuncture, and homeopathy, and essays by counterculture spokespersons such as Alan Watts, Gary Snyder, Timothy Leary, and Allen Ginsberg. At the beginning of 1968, the Oracle was acquired by a group of Sufis living in Marin County. They brought a more tranquil religious focus to the paper and began a series of articles on local spiritual groups. It was in this series that the feature on the order appeared. As would be the case with most media treatment throughout this period, the article adopted a generally respectful attitude toward the movement. It lauded Blyton's emphasis on validated spiritual experience and his distrust of conventional priestcraft and dogmatism. The article also praised the group's service work at Brother Juniper's Inn and the Fillmore Aid Station, and its policy of non-solicitation and communal ownership. membership. In an interview, member Eric Fuchs explained that brother houses were not communes, but schools of initiation where students were trained to contact their own God nature. Members wore clerical attire, he added, as a constant reminder both to themselves and to the world that they were a holy order working for the betterment of humanity. The article also gave the addresses of the order's two missionary stations outside California. The first of these had been established by Bill Canwright and Gary Spear in Honolulu on February 21, 1969. Why Blyton chose Hawaii as a mission center is unknown, but it is interesting to note that the Subramania order, with whom Blyton had remained on friendly terms, had set up its new international headquarters on Kauai during this period. In any event, Hawaii proved to be a fortuitous location for missionary work, as the islands were crowded at the time with young, rootless hippies who were experimenting with various forms of spiritual culture. Elements of this subpopulation began attending the Order's Tuesday and Thursday evening classes within a short time of their introduction. Over the ensuing 7 years, the Hawaii Center would become a vital conduit for Order recruits. In March, a newly married pair of priests, Martin and Denise Swanson, set out to establish the movement's second mission station in Chicago. The two stayed with Martin Swanson's parents while they sought a suitable building for a center. When they had lined up several possibilities, they asked the Blytons to come to Chicago to approve the final arrangements. This would be the only time the Order's founder left the western United States during his tenure as general director. Shortly after his arrival, Blyton approved the purchase of the group's first property outside San Francisco, a modest apartment building on West Berthoud Avenue. The Chicago Center would become one of 3 order seminaries in the United States, the other 2 being in San Francisco and Boston. The Hawaii and Chicago mission stations grew steadily during 1969, as did the centers in San Francisco. On October 27, 1969, Blyton announced that he had received a revelation directing him to prepare the first large-scale wave of order missionaries. The Esoteric Council responded to this calling forth of the Sons of Light by declaring all life-vowed members who had attained illumination eligible for missionary service. The new mission teams did not set out until a subsequent communication on November 10th specified Fort Worth, Des Moines, Lincoln, Nebraska, Boston, and Elkhorn, New Mexico as the cities to which missionaries should be sent. The same message indicated Idaho, Kansas, Kentucky, and Colorado as states that would soon have order centers. It also prophesied that the order would appeal mainly to the young, who would be drawn from many parts of the world, and that before the end of 1970 the movement's membership would have swelled to great proportions. Blyton was admonished not to have undue concern for the half-trained condition of his youthful emissaries. The new heaven and the new earth were near, and the little ones would be taught by the Spirit as they carried out their urgent mission. In a message received on January 22, 1970, the Master Jesus enjoined the new missionaries to carry the eternal fire of the Christos from city to city across the country like the runners of old. They were to